Today, we're going to talk about something that can feel confusing, unsettling, and strangely empowering all at once. When you deal with a narcissistic person, their behavior is rarely random. It is strategic, reactive, and deeply tied to their fear of losing control. What most people don't realize is that when you begin to grow, set boundaries, detach emotionally, or simply stop feeding their need for validation, something shifts. The narcissist doesn't just get annoyed, they get threatened. Their behavior escalates, becomes erratic or suddenly hostile, not because you are weak, but because you are no longer predictable. This is the moment when their inner chaos is exposed. What you're witnessing is fear of your clarity, your independence, and your refusal to be manipulated. When a narcissist behaves in certain extreme ways, it's a sign that the power dynamic has changed and they know it. You are no longer someone they can dominate, and that realization shakes them at their core. When a narcissist begins to fear you, it's not because you suddenly became aggressive or confrontational. It's because something fundamental in you changed. You stopped explaining yourself. You stopped chasing their approval. You stopped absorbing their chaos as if it were your responsibility. That shift is deeply destabilizing for someone who relies on control, attention, and emotional reactions to feel powerful. What looks like their darkness losing power is actually you reclaiming yours. The narcissist senses this long before you may fully recognize it yourself. One of the first signs this fear shows up is escalation. They may become louder, colder, more critical, or oddly provocative. This is not confidence on their part. It is panic. When their usual tactics stop working, they intensify them. Your calm becomes intolerable to them because it reflects a loss of access to your emotional energy. Your boundaries feel like rejection to someone who equates control with safety. Their darkness feeds on your self-doubt, and when that supply dries up, they feel exposed. You may also notice sudden attempts to undermine you. Subtle insults, questioning your competence, rewriting history, or portraying themselves as the victim. This happens when they sense you no longer see them as superior. Your clarity threatens the narrative they depend on to feel important. When you no longer buy into their version of reality, their inner instability surfaces. They need you confused second, guessing and small. When you aren't, their power erodes. Another sign is withdrawal mixed with surveillance. They may pull back emotionally, yet remain oddly attentive to what you're doing. This is fear disguised as indifference. They are trying to regain a sense of dominance without direct engagement. Your independence is unsettling because it signals that you are no longer orbiting around them. The less reactive you become, the more they realize they cannot control the outcome, and that uncertainty terrifies them. What's important to understand is that this fear is not about you becoming cruel or unkind. It's about you becoming whole. When you stop overgiving, over-explaining, and over-functioning, you disrupt a dynamic that once benefited them. Your self-respect acts like a mirror, reflecting back the emptiness they try to avoid. That is why their behavior can suddenly seem darker, harsher, or more desperate. It is not a sign you are doing something wrong. It is evidence that you are doing something right. This phase can feel lonely because growth often does. But it is also profoundly empowering. You begin to realize that their reactions are not a measure of your worth, but a response to your strength. Their darkness loses power when you stop engaging with it, when you refuse to be baited, and when you choose peace over proving a point. You are no longer a source they can drain, and that realization shifts the balance in ways that are uncomfortable for them and transformative for you. Because fear only arises when control is slipping, and the illusion is cracking, and you are standing more firmly in yourself than ever before. When a narcissist feels intimidated by you, it is rarely because you are trying to overpower them. It happens when your light becomes steady, self-defined, and no longer dependent on their approval. Your growth exposes what they work tirelessly to hide. Narcissists depend on comparison, hierarchy, and control to regulate their fragile sense of self. When you begin to trust yourself, set limits, and detach from their emotional turbulence, you disrupt the imbalance that once made them feel superior. Your confidence is not loud, but it is undeniable, and that is what threatens them most. They act out because intimidation activates their deepest insecurity. Your clarity highlights their lack of it. Your emotional regulation highlights their dysregulation. Your ability to walk away highlights their fear of abandonment. Instead of reflecting inward, they externalize that discomfort. Acting out becomes a way to restore dominance. You may see criticism increase, sarcasm sharpen, or blame intensify. This is not strength on their part. It is a stress response. When they feel small, they try to make you smaller. Your light also threatens the stories they tell themselves. Narcissists rely on a narrative where they are exceptional, and others exist to reinforce that belief. When you stop playing that role, the script collapses. Your independence tells them they are not as powerful as they imagined. That realization is intolerable. Acting out becomes a defense against shame, a way to avoid facing their inner emptiness. They provoke reactions because reactions reassure them they still matter. Another reason they act out is loss of access. Your emotional availability was once a resource. When you stop over-explaining, over-apologizing, or over-accommodating, they feel cut off. Your boundaries feel like betrayal to someone who views people as extensions of themselves. Acting out is an attempt to break those boundaries and pull you back into familiar chaos. Calmness becomes a threat because it signals you are no longer entangled. What is often misunderstood is that intimidation does not come from aggression. It comes from authenticity. When you align your actions with your values, you become unpredictable to someone who relied on your self-doubt. You are no longer easy to manipulate. That loss of control creates fear. Acting out is a way to regain certainty in an environment where they feel exposed and unimportant. This dynamic can be deeply painful, especially if you once cared deeply about them, but it is also a sign of transformation. Their reaction is evidence that you are no longer shrinking to keep the peace. Your light is not something you turned on to provoke them. It is something you allowed yourself to reclaim. You are choosing self-respect over self-abandonment. The more you stand in that space, the more their behavior reveals itself as desperation rather than authority. You do not need to dim yourself to manage someone else's insecurity. Their intimidation is not your responsibility. Acting out is their language of fear, and your steadiness is your answer. The moment you stop taking their behavior personally is the moment your light becomes untouchable, and they are left confronting what they have spent a lifetime avoiding within themselves, and that is the quiet power that keeps growing even when no one is watching. There comes a moment in your life when something quietly but decisively changes. You don't announce it. You don't argue your way into it. You simply rise. You become more grounded, more self-trusting, less reactive, and that is when the energy shifts. Narcissists are exquisitely sensitive to changes in power dynamics, especially emotional power. When you rise internally, even without changing anything externally, they feel it, and what you often see next is not admiration, but fear. This fear reveals itself through subtle but telling changes in behavior. Where there was once confidence, there may now be irritability. Where there was charm, there may now be contempt. The narcissist senses that you are no longer oriented around them, and that loss of centrality is deeply unsettling. They are no longer the axis around which your emotional world turns. You are no longer seeking cues from them to define your worth. That shift threatens the fragile structure they rely on to feel secure. As you rise, you may notice them becoming more controlling or oddly dismissive. This is not coincidence. Control is their attempt to restore an imbalance that once favored them. Dismissiveness is their attempt to minimize what they cannot dominate. When you stop reacting the way you used to, their usual strategies fail. Your calm becomes confronting. Your silence becomes powerful. Your boundaries feel like walls they cannot climb. Another way fear shows up is through projection. They may accuse you of being cold, selfish, or arrogant. In reality, they are reacting to your autonomy. Your growth forces them to confront their own stagnation, and that is a confrontation they avoid at all costs. Rather than self-reflect, they externalize their discomfort onto you. If they can label you as the problem, they don't have to face the internal void your progress highlights. You may also sense a tightening in the dynamic, as though they are watching you more closely. This hypervigilance comes from uncertainty. When they could predict your reactions, they felt safe. When you rise, you become less predictable. You are no longer easy to provoke, guilt, or manipulate. That unpredictability creates anxiety, and anxiety often turns into aggression or withdrawal. What matters most here is understanding that this shift is not something you need to manage. It is not your job to reassure someone who feels threatened by your health. Rising does not mean becoming louder or more dominant. It means becoming more aligned with yourself, and alignment is destabilizing to anyone who depends on yourself. Doubt to feel superior. This phase can feel disorienting because the relationship no longer operates by familiar rules. You may grieve what once was, even as you recognize that what once was required you to stay small. But the fear you see in them is not a sign to stop growing. It is confirmation that you are no longer participating in a dynamic that diminished you. When you rise, energy shifts because truth enters the space, masks slip, illusions weaken, and while that can provoke fear in others, it creates clarity in you. You begin to see that their reactions are not about love or connection, but about control and loss. The more you stay rooted in your values, the more that fear becomes visible, because it is nowhere left to hide and you are no longer bending yourself to keep someone else comfortable while abandoning your own inner stability, and the shift continues quietly reshaping everything around you, even else. You remain steady in who you are becoming. There is a point in your life where your strength stops being performative and becomes internal. You no longer need to prove, persuade, or defend who you are. That kind of strength is quiet, but it is unmistakable, and people who rely on dominance and manipulation feel it immediately. When someone senses that you are spiritually untouchable, their behavior changes, not because you have attacked them, but because they can no longer penetrate your sense of self. One of the clearest signs is that their words stop landing the way they used to. Criticism that once cut deep now feels hollow. Insults feel more revealing than hurtful. You may notice that they repeat the same tactics, but with diminishing impact. This frustrates them because your emotional center is no longer accessible. You are no longer organized around their approval or disapproval. That detachment signals strength, and it unsettles anyone who once benefited from your reactivity. Another behavior is inconsistency. They may alternate between trying to provoke you and trying to charm you. This push and pull reflects confusion. They are searching for the version of you they could influence, but that version is no longer available. Your steadiness disrupts their internal map of how relationships work. When you don't rise to the bait or rush to soothe them, they feel powerless, and that powerlessness is deeply uncomfortable. You may also notice attempts to diminish your growth. They might mock your boundaries, minimize your achievements, or frame your self-respect as selfishness. This is not an accurate assessment of you. It is an attempt to restore a hierarchy that no longer exists. When you are spiritually untouchable, you don't need to dominate to feel secure. That contrast exposes their dependence on control, and exposure often leads to defensive behavior. Silence is another powerful indicator. Not the silent treatment meant to punish, but your silence. When you stop over-explaining, over-justifying, and oversharing, you reclaim your energy. That restraint communicates confidence. You are no longer seeking validation through being understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. Your silence tells them that you trust yourself more than you need their agreement. What makes you untouchable is not perfection or invulnerability. It is alignment. Your actions match your values. Your boundaries reflect self-respect. You are no longer negotiating your worth. That alignment creates a kind of presence that cannot be manipulated. People sense when you are no longer available for emotional extraction, and those who thrive on imbalance react strongly to that shift. This can feel lonely because strength often requires separation from dynamics that once felt familiar, but it is also deeply freeing. You begin to recognize that their reactions are not a referendum on your character, but a response to your clarity. You are not hardening your heart, you are strengthening your core, and when your core is strong, chaos has nothing to attach itself to. Being spiritually untouchable does not mean you never feel pain. It means pain no longer defines you or controls your choices. You observe rather than absorb. You respond rather than react. And in doing so, you move through the world with a grounded confidence that no one can take from you, because it was never given to you by them in the first place, and it continues to grow the more you choose yourself over the need to be validated by someone who cannot meet you where you now stand. As you move forward, remember that your growth was never meant to be comfortable for everyone. When you step into clarity, strength, and self-respect, the world around you rearranges itself. Some people rise with you, and others reveal their fear. That fear is not a signal to stop. It is a signal that you have crossed a threshold where you no longer abandon yourself to keep peace. You are learning to trust your inner compass instead of external validation, and that changes everything. You no longer need to explain your boundaries or justify your healing. The right people will feel steadied by your presence, not threatened by it. Those who react with hostility, control, or manipulation are showing you where they are stuck, not where you are failing. Your job is not to rescue them from that discomfort. Your job is to stay anchored in who you are becoming. Strength does not always look dramatic. Often it looks like calm, consistency, and choosing not to engage in chaos. It looks like walking away without hatred and standing firm without cruelty. As you continue to choose yourself, you will notice that peace becomes more familiar than conflict, clarity more natural than confusion, and confidence more sustainable than approval. This is the quiet, lasting power of a life lived in alignment, where your energy is protected, your voice is grounded, and your presence no longer asks permission to exist.